Stanford University.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, and it's my pleasure to host you at this evening's session of the 2019 Contemplation by Design Summit. As you know, we're gathered here to be in conversation about social action, higher education, contemplative practices, and civic engagement and responsible citizenship in a democracy. It is our joy to bring together 3 women to lead reflections after the conversation and 3 men to be in conversation. You each will have received a program for this evening that includes the full bio of all 6 individuals contributing to the evening. I'm going to simply name each person. Beginning at the end with the evening's reflections, we have Roberta Katz, Emmeline de la Peña, and Michelle Renninger, who will be each leading sessions following the conversation. On stage, we're joined by Harry Elam, closest to me, Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, Vice President for the Arts, and on the far side, Tom Schnaubelt, Executive Director of the Haas Center for Public Service. Momentarily, we will have Parker Palmer joining us. Oh, here we have him, right in the center, excuse me, from his home. We're grateful to him for finding a way to join us in his busy schedule. The format for the evening will be his membership through the streaming and then a live conversation between the 3 on stage. I'm going to just share briefly, for those of you who have not been attending the summit, that the summit's intention is to cohere the community, to reflect, rest, and renew ourselves through contemplative practices so that we can sustain wholehearted, purposeful engagement in teaching, research, learning, and service. We use an acronym inspired by the largest bell in the Carillon set of bells, the Bourdon bell, that has inscribed on it, "For peace alone I do ring." Thus, we use those letters, P for pause, pause the striving, competitive, analytical mind, exhale, to let go of what's no longer necessary and create spaciousness for new possibilities. Attend mindfully to come back to your senses, an idiom that often means become wise and discerning. Connect to yourself compassionately, connect to others compassionately, and then express through service in large endeavors or small gestures to your neighbor, to your family, to your dorm mate, to your teacher, to your community, to your nation, or to the world. We come together to look at how we can use this unique opportunity of our time in higher education to further hone the integrated role of contemplative life in our activity as a citizen in a democracy. I'm going to move now to the questions that each member of the conversation will answer in sequence, and then the conversation will open up for a free flow of dialogue between them. The questions are provided to you in your program. The first question is posed first to Parker. I didn't introduce you, Parker. Bear with me, I apologize. Parker Palmer is joining us from his home, as I mentioned, and he founded the Center for Courage and Renewal. He has been a social psychologist and educator for decades, inspiring teachers and public servants and young citizens in how to be engaged in wise social action. He has resources available through his program, Courage and Renewal, that I encourage all of you to look at on their website, and they are also summarized in your program to some extent, and the conversation will illuminate that further. Without further ado, I invite Parker Palmer to answer the question, what happened in your life that woke you to the relationships among contemplative practice, higher education, public service, and the interpersonal and intrapersonal skills, which you wisely have named the habits of the heart, necessary for the civic engagement instrumental to democracy?
Well, thank you, Tia, and thanks to Tom and Harry for joining me in this conversation, and to everyone in the audience. I'm honored to be part of this important Stanford event. I want to apologize to Tom and Harry for not wearing a suit coat tonight. I actually burned mine when I retired, so afraid that's not available. And let me tell our telecasting friends that I've lost the picture of what's happening on stage. So if I could get that back, it would be great. So let me start my response to your question, Tia, by offering a definition of contemplation, one of the fundamental terms that we're working with this evening. My own sense is that contemplation is any way one has of penetrating illusion and touching reality. Any way one has of penetrating illusion and touching reality, whether the illusions are about yourself, about the world, or about the ways in which you and the world intersect and connect. And I think it's important to say, as we enter a discussion about contemplation, that people have all kinds of ways of doing that. Some people are at one end of the spectrum, which I suppose we might call mystical or transcendent experience. But some people like me are at the other end quite often, where we contemplate, we penetrate illusion through something called abject failure. That's why I've often said that I'm not a contemplative by intention as much as a contemplative by catastrophe. But my big point is that contemplation, or so it seems to me, is not hooked to any one practice or technique. It's driven by the big experiment called living one's life. I was inspired early on by the fact that Gandhi called his autobiography the story of my experiments with truth. So with that little background, let me be very direct about answering what happened in my life that started me down this path. And to put it in a nutshell, what happened for me was the University of California at Berkeley in the 1960s. But I should quickly say with this audience that I also root for the Cardinal. Berkeley in the 60s, I don't need to say a lot about it to this audience, but a lot was happening and a lot influenced me. I was influenced by a vision of community, and I was influenced by what I felt was the imperative to get engaged with the critical social issues of that time, which I believe are perennial social issues, certainly alive in our time in some very unfortunate ways. So when I got my PhD in sociology in 1969, I did not feel called to go into academic life, which is what I thought I was preparing for. The decade, of course, had been one in which the Vietnam War raged. The Black Panthers were rising in Oakland. An early form of feminism, at least for that part of the 20th century, was arising. My heroes had been assassinated. And I felt a calling away from academia toward using my sociology in the streets. And so I went to Washington, D.C. and became a community organizer around issues of racial justice. But back in the day, even way back in that day, the late 60s and the early 70s, the message to people like me, people who look like me, from Black activists was already clear. And that message was this: we don't want you working in the Black community. The problem of racism originates with white people, a community you should know well because you are part of it. So work your side of the street. I confess that that was a lot for an idealistic young white man, me, to swallow. So my contemplative practice, I think, looking back, began right then in self-examination, a process that never ends, and eventually brought me to acknowledge not only my white privilege, which is pretty obvious, I think, but also my own unconscious form of white supremacy, which I think is an important acknowledgement for white people to make. I think it's a cop-out to stop with white privilege, which is so very obvious, but also to dig deeper in a contemplative mode of self-examination, again, through hard life experience, as well as reflection, meditation, prayer, whatever form it takes for you, to dig deeper and understand that within, I believe, all white people, there lurks some nascent form of white supremacy. So I think that was my first deep dive into the link between contemplation and action, because I could not have gone on about my work as a community organizer working toward racial justice in the DC area, trying to prevent things like redlining and blockbusting, if I had not penetrated some illusions, at least, that I had about myself and about the world around where it was that I belonged and what it was that I needed to be doing. As I've thought about it, I've thought, well, a next step in trying to deal with or trying to learn a contemplative level of life and engagement came when something happened to me that happens to a lot of activists. After about 3 years of heavy lifting as a community organizer, came burnout, which is a common experience, one we all know, I think, on one level or another. But that calls for another kind of self-examination around one's motivations for acting and one's assumptions about the ends or the goals of action. I have come to think that burnout is not simply about trying to give too much. I think it's sometimes about trying to give what you don't have to give, what does not grow up and replenish itself within you. You're operating out of a series of oughts rather than out of a deep sense of self and giftedness. This is a long story in my 80-year-old life, so I'm not going to tell the whole thing. But let me just cut to the chase and say where this contemplative journey took me. I think we're wedded in this society to something called effectiveness. But if you're working, and I certainly was, but if you're working for justice, truth, and love, you can't possibly be, quote, effective in the long run. Name any hero of yours who lived and died by values like love, truth, and justice, and then ask yourself how many of them were able to die saying, I'm sure glad I took that task on, because now everyone in the world can check it off their to-do list forever and ever. It seems to me that the more tightly we cling to the norm of effectiveness, the more likely we are to die in despair. It's just not going to happen. Or, short of dying in despair, we start taking on smaller and smaller tasks because they are the only ones with which we can be effective. Love, truth, and justice will disappear from our vision of what we want to give ourselves to and be replaced by something much more modest, much less significant, and in some cases, much more illusory. The best example I have to give at this moment that I think most people recognize is that in this society, we no longer care about educating children. That's a long-term task that isn't going to be accomplished anytime soon. You often don't know whether you've educated somebody until you're 40 or 50 years down the road. So we no longer care about that. We only care about getting kids to pass tests, which in no way equals educating them. Because when we set out to get kids to pass tests, we can achieve effectiveness, or at least the appearance of effectiveness, even if we have to cheat to do it. So to me, these are some of the markers on my path of awakening to the connections between contemplative practice, public service, examination of one's heart, and leading eventually to civic engagement instrumental to democracy. Maybe under later questions, Tia, that I know you're going to ask, I can speak more directly about higher education and what I think it can do in this important mix of ideas. But let me just for now lay it down there.
Thank you, Parker. Tom, would you answer the same question?
Sure. First of all, I just want to say how grateful I am to be on in this conversation with Harry and with Parker. I kept joking to my wife on the way over here that I would like to cede all of my time to Parker so that I could hear more from him. It's a tough question for me, the weaving all of these different things together, but as I was thinking about these things, I came up with sort of three small stories that I thought I would share with you. The middle one is probably the closest to getting to all of those things. But the first story happened, I see a bunch of folks that I know from Stanford, and I know that folks have heard me talk about the fact that I grew up on a farm in Wisconsin. And it actually relates to that because I grew up on a farm and I had 4 brothers and a sister and a dad that was, he was not at all contemplative, but one of the things that he did, I just look back at it and I'm kind of amazed at how wise it was, but I think maybe it was because he was just trying to get rid of, like, when something was going wrong or somebody was behaving badly, he probably was just trying to sort of get some distance. But what he would do is if we were working on a project, and this would be when I was probably a teenager, we were working on a project and say 2 of us were getting in, some kind of a fight or one of us was acting out, he would actually tell us, he would say, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to walk to the other end of the farm and I want you to pick up a beer can that is sitting in an old tire on the other end of the farm. And I mean, I still don't understand what the beer cans were doing in the tires. These tires were sort of markers around the farm too, but I should probably ask my dad that when I go home for Thanksgiving. Dad, but it was the idea was that we were being asked to sort of just go away, take a walk. We were outside, and without fail, every time we got back, we were kind of like, all right, what was that all about? Like, why was I acting up? And so when you asked that question, I was thinking that's the first sort of thing that I ever kind of really learned about contemplative practice, which was, I think, not intended as a contemplative practice. So the second story is probably more in line with all of the things he wanted us to weave together about contemplative practice and higher education and public service. And it actually has to do with how I became involved in the field of public service at all. My original degree was in physics. I had actually planned to go into being a patent attorney or an intellectual properties lawyer. but had an experience right after graduation where I came back and I thought, I don't want to go to law school. I actually want to go and study education. I was idealistic. I wanted to go in and see about figuring out how to end the cycle of poverty through education. And I enrolled at the University of Michigan, and I was there pursuing a PhD. And about a year into it, I had sort of this crisis of like, I hate this. I really didn't like what I was studying. I had sort of understood, I was in physics as an undergrad, just sitting in the library doing P-sets with my friends, and I ended up just really feeling like I don't want to be in a field where I'm speaking to one or two other people about a really narrow topic, and I thought, well, education was supposed to be really practical. I was pretty naive about academics at the time. And somehow I got wind of this program called Alternative Spring Break at the University of Michigan. And it was mostly undergrads. I was literally the only graduate student that applied that year. And I went on this alternative break where we were actually doing work. It was a small group of students who studied the role of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on the Mississippi River and what their role was in flooding and sort of how that impacted communities along the river. That year, they experienced catastrophic flooding in sort of southern, central Illinois along the Mississippi River, and our group went out and did some service work for the week of spring break. That experience totally changed me. It was like a light bulb went off and thought, that's the kind of education that I was really kind of signing up for when I went to graduate school. So after that, and part of the reason that it was so powerful was that it was student-led. It had embedded throughout the whole experience, the whole semester running up to it, we were doing all sorts of reflection, processing, analyzing, and just thinking really creatively about, all right, what can we do? But it was very much connected to making a difference in the world. So I was really interested in that intersection between making a difference and education. So the following year, I led one of those trips, and that was even more impactful because I began to see, oh, this is something that I could do even longer term. And so the power there for me in terms of the connection of contemplative practice in higher education and public service, all three of those things really came together for me for the first time. And that's what has allowed me to then kind of make a career of doing this work in higher education. The last story, Tia will probably be kind of embarrassed for me to say this, but actually happened here at Stanford, where about 5 or 6 years ago, I was having a lot of neck problems. I was like, my arm went numb. I was having problems in one of my pectoral muscles. And I went to the doctor, and it was one of those weird things where the doctor sort of did a couple tests. He says, oh, I think you've got a herniated disc between C5 and C6. And I was like, how do you know that? And they did an MRI. They found all this out. And I basically I started going to Tia's morning workout class. So, sorry, Tia, but shameless plug for this class. It starts at 6:30 in the morning, so you got to be a morning person. But the idea was that I was getting out, I was with people, we were having really interesting conversations, but it was actually the connection of the physicality too. I had gone to the doctor, they had given me whatever codeine kind of pills or pain pills to try to reduce the stress or reduce the inflammation. Didn't really do anything. I haven't been to the doctor since I've actually started this class. I don't have any more back pain anymore. And it's literally that it's not just the physical act of stretching. I really do believe that it's about being with other people in connection with them, having conversations. It turns out now that it's actually a small little class of mostly RFs, so it's kind of a funny little group of people who are like, what happened in your dorm last night? So those are my 3 stories that touch upon all these different topics.
We can include that it is at sunrise outside.
It is outside, yes. And we often go to the top of McMurtry and watch the sunrise. So it's a beautiful class. If you want to know more, come and talk to me. It's a great class. And I'm not being paid by Tia to say that.
Thank you, Tom.
Sounds great.
Harry, please tell us what woke you to these relationships.
I love the concept of being woke to it. I want to start actually with my parents and the idea of social justice, because that was a critical influence for me for thinking. My father, while I was growing up, became the first black Chief Justice of the Boston Municipal Court. My mother, children's librarian, was the librarian in charge of the libraries as part of the Boston public school systems. And together, in their own way, they practiced daily ideas of social justice and passed it on to their children. They cared profoundly about education, and this is manifest in my mother made sure that every student of color in those Boston public schools had books that were written about and by people that looked like them. My father tried to start within the courts a program aimed at stemming the tide of young black boys appearing before him and other justices within the court. Because this was a time of Boston segregation and a condition that stunted the growth intellectually of many children, my parents, and I was fortunate, they sent us to private school. I went to an all-boys private school, and there I did a lot of theater extracurricularly. I started an organization called The Family, which was this black youth Boston-based drama organization. And the plays we did and performed were plays about social justice, plays that came out of the 60s and all the fervor that Parker mentioned earlier, and the sense that this was something, theater was something that could be a force to get people to think and potentially to act. Theater could serve as a social weapon. It was interesting too, I got to senior year, and I always, at that point at Harvard, thought I was gonna be a lawyer. And I realized that senior year that the only thing that excited me about following my father into the law was the drama of the courtroom. So I went and got a PhD in drama at Berkeley. And that proved to be, in a sense, the drama, the most social and collective of arts, has always proved for me to be the thing that connects to social justice and ideas of community, and also of ideas in terms of contemplation. So the moment of contemplation, I wanted to bring Parker back in with Parker's own words. And one of the 5 principles is the capacity to create community. And here's Parker saying, without a community, it is nearly impossible to achieve voice. It takes a village to raise a Rosa Parks. Without a community, it is nearly impossible to exercise the power of one in ways that allow powers to multiply. So it took a village to translate Parks' act of personal integrity into social change. So that sense of community being a key function. And theater often is about that community in so many different ways. So I take you ahead from there, from graduate school to teaching at Stanford, and it was September 9/11 to be precise, and I was teaching a class as part of sophomore college, a class that was on theater for social change. And 9/11 hit, and you know, I'm sure looking at this audience, you all probably remember exactly where you were when that hit. And in terms of the definition of contemplation about reality, clearly that was a moment that shook reality, made us think potentially different about the space that we lived in, made us think potentially differently about citizenship, or what that required, or what it meant, what being an American meant, but certainly what for the students in the class, and for me, what it meant to be doing this class. So we were supposed to do a class project, a final class project, and all of the students were doing individual projects, but then 9/11 happened, and all of the students said, let's do a collaborative project. We want to work together in community to tell the story in a way. It was a final showcase that was put on, and we put it on for the rest of sophomore college. Sophomore college, as you may know at Stanford, is a program where students come back in that preterm we call September studies before the start of the school in the fall, and take one course intensively. And there's about 300 students or so doing it. The 300 students came to see the performance that we had done or worked out for 9/11, for that time, for thinking contemplatively about all that had happened, and for that moment of community and bringing people together. And the performance was powerful. And it was powerful, I think, because of the time and context and the moment. And it's interesting that that sometimes is how we interact with art, in a moment, in a time, in a space that has that kind of connective tissue that can't happen anyplace else and is memorable for that. Victor Turner, he talks about this idea, the scholar, he talks about what he calls communitas. And communitas is this moment of effervescence, this moment of feeling of oneness. It doesn't happen often, doesn't happen all the time, but happened in that moment in the theater, right then. And for all of us, that was something of a release that I think can be part of contemplation as well. That was the moment of feeling that sense of togetherness as the first principle. And it was a moment also that allowed us, in a sense, to go on from there in terms of finishing the time that was sophomore college or moving then into the quarter. So that for me was a really, powerful moment, and a moment that others within that have would remember as well in that class. And it happens sometimes. Students come back now from that class and remember that day. I don't remember them. They look much older, too old to be my students. But just kidding. But anyway, that was an important moment in terms of that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. All of your stories animate these concepts beautifully. We'll move now to the next question, which again, I invite you to answer in sequence and then to flow into free-flowing dialogue and conversation as you consider the final question. The next question is, tell us about your work in relation to contemplative practices, higher education, service, habits of the heart, and civic engagement. And the final question that you'll flow into from that is, what are the ways that higher education can better incorporate contemplative practices and public service to cultivate the habits of the heart that are necessary for civic engagement and democracy? We'll go with the same order of answering and then open it up just for free conversation. Parker, if you'd talk a little more about your work. Thank you.
Thanks, Tia, and thanks to both Tom and Harry. So I wish my name were Dick, so this could be Tom, Dick, and Harry. Tom, Parker, and Harry, which is great with me. Even though I left academia to become a community organizer, I began writing books after a while, and my writing soon returned me to academic life. I spent 40 years working independently and being on the road a lot, and a lot of my road work was on college and university campuses. So I really left in order to come back, I think. Writing has been a big part of my work, but I have always been interested in what I call putting wheels on ideas so that people can ride them toward creative destinations. That's one of the reasons I founded the Center for Courage and Renewal. It's also one of the reasons I'm a huge fan of service learning, which goes beyond ideas as ends in themselves and embodies them in action. And I think that embodiment in action is where some of the deepest learning takes place for human beings. I mean, we aren't disembodied brains, we are embodied minds. I will always remember something that Candace Pert, the great neurobiologist, once said. She said the brain may live in the cranium, but the mind lives throughout the body. And I think that scholars in many fields, from feminism to hardcore biology, will attest that we know in all kinds of ways, including bodily knowledge, relational knowledge, as well as cognitive and problem-solving knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. And so any way that we have of putting wheels on ideas has been important to me. I wrote my first book about civic engagement in 1981. It didn't do real well. That was the year that Ronald Reagan assumed the presidency. And there wasn't a huge market for what I was writing about, which really had to do with reinvigorating our public life, which I think can also be called our pre-political life, for the sake of the health of democracy. Because there's this critical layer in our society between the structures of power and our rather fragile private lives, a critical layer called the public or pre-political life, that as it disintegrates, as those bonds of public life come apart, it makes democracy itself more and more difficult. And I think we're living into some of that in the current era of American troubles. I was first turned on to this in graduate school by reading the great book Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville, published when he was a mere 30 years old. And he argues in that book, as many of you will know, that the future of democracy in America, and he's writing now from 1835 or thereabouts, the future of democracy in America will depend very heavily on the health of local venues, voluntary associations, religious communities, neighborhood associations, village associations, all kinds of ways in which people get together, either around beliefs or around shared work or around shared civic concerns, in which what he called habits of the heart get developed. And his question was, will those habits of the heart be the sort that are supportive of democracy, or will they be the type that leave people prone towards various forms of autocracy, even fascism, which subsequent writers such as Erich Fromm have written eloquently about in books like The Escape from Freedom, where there's this part of the human heart that may say it wants to be free, but it really doesn't. It wants the strong leader to take care of everything in a time of fear, even if the leader isn't truly strong, but is merely posturing as strong. Under those conditions, all kinds of con games can be pulled off. My first book in 1981, The Company of Strangers, was really aimed at the mainline Protestant and Catholic churches, which at that time were a big part of the fabric of public life. And I think the book stimulated a lot of constructive conversation in those circles by offering people a way to get engaged with the politics of democracy that had nothing to do with advocating for certain candidates or certain policies, but had everything to do with building, reweaving the social fabric, which was already tattering at the end of the 60s and on through the 70s, becoming tattered and needed to be rewoven in order to support the requirements of a democratic government. You can't have, if you don't have a body politic, if you don't have a civic community, you can't have a democracy. And I think too little attention has been paid to rebuilding this or reweaving the civic community itself. So I returned to those themes with another book some 30 years later called Healing the Heart of Democracy, when the deep divisions in our body politic had become, to me, quite evident. By then, the nonprofit I had founded, the Center for Courage and Renewal, was up and running with 300 facilitators around the country. And lots of circles formed around the themes in Healing the Heart of Democracy. Circles that took place in places ranging from public libraries to neighborhood associations, to religious communities and other sorts of voluntary associations, political advocacy groups, educational institutions, elementary schools through colleges and universities, and even in some workplaces. And I tried in Healing the Heart of Democracy to lift up several ideas that I think remain important today. One is the fact that our democracy, rightly understood, is a tension-holding structure. The founders made a lot of horrific mistakes, including their hardcore racism and their strong exclusionary tendencies. We, the people, had a very narrow meaning for them. But they had the genius to create a tension-holding structure of government, which, when it's operating as it should, is capable of correcting the founders themselves. And the best example of that is that over the years, the meaning of we the people has become a lot larger because that tension was held within the structures of government than just white landed gentry, which is what the founders had in mind, white male landed gentry. I think the quickest way to say this in the course of a brief discussion is that our system of government is the first one I know anything about in human history, in which conflict and tension was not meant to be the enemy of a good social order, but the engine of a better social order. That tension, rightly held, has the capacity to move us forward. I think there's a lot, that's a theme in higher education too. Tension and conflict around critical ideas holds the potential of generating better ideas, just as tension and conflict held in a democracy holds the potential of generating a better social order. And I'm one of millions of people who are hoping that the really ripping, tearing, heart-wrenching tensions we're holding today can in fact be held long enough and creatively enough to bring this country a better social order than the one we have. My own sense is that one of the few redeeming features of what's going on politically these days is that it is being revealed unto us that we really, really need a more perfect union. And we have never had one. We have been living by a mythology about America. But if we can't hold those tensions within ourselves and between ourselves in community and the institutions that the founders gave us become so debilitated or dysfunctional that they can't hold the tensions either, then we are in what we Quakers would call deep oatmeal. So there's that. I also tried to lift up in Healing the Heart of Democracy 5 Habits of the Heart that I believe you'll be looking at in discussion groups this evening. And worked hard on the idea that when we're trying to talk across lines of division, it's more important to be in right relationship than to be right. Despite all of the heartbreak in the world today around folks not being able to talk with members of their own families, I still believe that it's more important to be in right relationships than it is to be right. And I have to constantly ask myself when I go into a conversation across lines of difference, why am I here? What am I trying to accomplish? If I'm trying to win an argument, I'm unlikely to get very far. But if I'm trying to strengthen and deepen a relationship which can hold complexity, which can hold tension, then I might make some progress. Because the truth about a lot of things in our society is complicated, and it takes more than one person's ideas to advance our understanding of what's good and true and beautiful about this or this or this. And if we can't construct strong relational containers for those conversations, then again, we're in very deep trouble. And I think that constructing a strong container for complicated, challenging conversations has a lot to do with at least beginning and grounding what we're doing in storytelling about our own lives, about where our convictions came from, and listening respectfully to another person tell us why their life experience has taken them in quite a different direction. We aren't necessarily going to come out agreeing on everything, not by a long shot, but the hope is that we can come out with a relationship maintained in which a next conversation will be possible, and a next, and a next. And if we can do that, I think we're doing what Alexis de Tocqueville wanted us to do by developing habits of the heart in communal settings that will help sustain the democratic experiment, which has never been secure and never will be secure. You know, I guess it was Franklin who said, "I'm giving you a republic if you can keep it." But also a democracy embedded, a representative democracy embedded within a constitutional republic, if you can keep it. And so those were some of the things I was trying to work toward in healing the heart of democracy, and all of the wheels on the ground vehicles that have come out of that book.
Thank you, Parker. Yeah, as you were talking about the creative tensions, I was just reminded we've been working with a really wonderful person named Kazu Haga. He's the founder of the West Point Peace Academy. East Point Peace Academy. And he talks about how conflict is the spirit of a relationship asking itself to deepen. And I love that idea. And he also talks a lot about the distinction between conflict resolution and conflict engagement. And I think those are really speaking to the concept of the creative tensions that we have to be better at managing, at understanding. My work, when Tia asked us to think about what your work is, that's a contemplative thing for me to think about, because I actually sort of look back over time, and I think the thread from my career since that alternative break is really in thinking about what role and what responsibilities do higher education institutions have to building what Parker was just talking about, a civic community. And the way that we have to do that is to cultivate civic identity and have that be part of what we're actually doing as institutions of higher learning. And I recently went through the process of, I didn't go through this process, that's probably revealing that I just said that. My daughter just went through the process of selecting a college or a university. And I wanted to share a quote because I actually think it sort of speaks to what I've tried to do with my career. Marilyn Robinson wrote, "We choose our colleges if we have a choice in order to be formed by them and supported by them in the identities we have or aspire to. If the graft takes, we consider ourselves ever after to be members of that community." And I think for me, the work that I've been doing here at Stanford and at other places is to really have institutions think about what is the model of community that you're actually holding up to students so that they want the graft to take. And for me, that is absolutely essential that we think about what role higher ed institutions play in cultivating that civic identity, mainly, in this case, through public service. The Haas Center for Public Service has been around since about 1985. We really seek to create, or actually to inspire Stanford to create a more just and sustainable world. We currently serve as the hub of Cardinal Service. And in that, what we see ourselves doing is to try to elevate public service as an essential part of the Stanford education. What we do, and I think that you'll have some of these frameworks, the principles of ethical and effective service. We actually do that work through two foundational sort of frameworks that we use. The first is the pathways of public service and civic engagement. And at this point, I just want to give a shout out because we have about 20, 24, raise your hand if you're here from one of the other institutions. We've got about 20 people here who've joined us from different institutions across the country that are actually thinking about pathways of public service and civic engagement and how we can collectively move this field forward of thinking about a framework that we can share across different institutions. For the purpose of this conversation, I want to focus more on the principles, but I would be doing a disservice if I didn't at least name the pathways that we sort of created to share with students and to provide them an intellectual framework about thinking about social change. So the first one is community engaged learning and research. The second is community organizing and activism. The third is direct service. The fourth is philanthropy. The fifth is policy and governance. And the sixth is social entrepreneurship and corporate social responsibility. And one of the conversations that we had over and over today with the group that's in the room that's joining us today is that we kept hearing, like, a lot of the folks that are doing this work are worried that sometimes when you say the word service or volunteerism, you think of only somebody, I can't remember which, I think it might have been Sarah from Juniata said, oh, people only think about digging holes and painting fences. And that's something that we're at Stanford and elsewhere, we're trying to get folks to have a much more complicated, complex view of what it means to create social change. And we view these as levers for social change, each one of these different forms of public service and civic engagement. These are not discipline specific, they're not issue bound, they're issue neutral. You could apply any of those pathways to solving any other social challenge that we have, social or environmental. The really fun part with students is to talk to them about where, this is not a perfect typology, but where do we have overlap? Like, so a lot of times we talk to students about, all right, well, so what does an anti-capitalist activist think about the concept of social entrepreneurship? There's a lot of really creative tensions and conflict, really, that we'll have to engage. So that's one of the sort of frameworks that we use at the Haas Center and here at Stanford. I want to turn to the principles because I think they're so relevant, and I'll name those as well. Humility, respect and inclusion, reciprocity, preparation, safety and well-being, accountability, evaluation, and learning and reflection. Some of those are sort of mindset principles, especially things like humility, respect and inclusion, reciprocity. Others are more mechanical, things like safety and well-being, preparation. I should mention that we just went through, these principles have existed since 2002, and this past year was the second time we went through a fairly rigorous review process and sort of made some modifications. We ended up with about 80 pages of notes from different meetings, including an all-hands meeting with the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, the entire staff. And it's remarkable, talk about conflict engagement. We had feedback that was polar opposites. Do this, no, put humility first, no, put it last. And we were sort of managing that whole thing. But paradoxically, the long version of this, I think the most important parts of these definitions, the way that we've gone about defining them, is in the questions that we ask. And so I'm going to read little excerpts from 3 of the principles and then one question, just to give you a sense or a flavor of what these are. So humility. Humility we talk about as being how we relate to ourselves, to our own goodness and limitations, and it involves placing ourselves among others and in the world at large. It compels us to listen generously and to be mindful of the needs and assets, interests, and expectations of others. Mindfulness, listening generously, relating to others. We wrote this before the Contemplation by Design Summit, but that is what we talk about when we talk about humility. The question in humility that I want to highlight is, what relationship do I have with those being served? And how do interpersonal and institutional positionality make humility challenging? I'll move on to the second one I wanted to highlight was learning and reflection. Reflection, contemplation. This is essential, and we have to make time and space for the continual introspection as we engage in service with others. The two questions I want to highlight about this are when, where, and how will I incorporate reflection opportunities in my experience? And I should mention, these questions are designed for students or faculty or staff who are interacting in a service environment. The second question is, how do I make safe and brave spaces available for participants to reflect? The third principle that I wanted to lift up is reciprocity. And I actually really do believe that in some ways reciprocity is something that it's actually a rejection of the notion of service itself. It's characterized by interdependence, and it's shared responsibility to work towards mutual benefit and growth. And here the question could be, what strategies can I use to show my appreciation to community partners for their educational role? We're actually sending students off campus, out of the classroom to have teachers who are not the folks that are the traditional teachers. And I think we always have to think about and be grateful for the community partners' role in educating our students. So those are just some of the principles and a little bit of a description of the work. I think I'm going to turn it over to you, Harry, to talk more about your work, and then we're going to turn it over to some things that we think we can and should do to incorporate more contemplative practice in higher education.
Thanks. I want to pick up on a few things you've said, but also one central idea, and that is that for me, the highest ideal of a democratic liberal arts education or liberal education needs to include contemplation and reflection. So they should be part of liberal education in my mind and thinking. And how do we do that? Well, first, what do we mean by liberal education, which is something that we're trying to practice here at Stanford and have for many years, and the sense that it is something that is constantly reborn at Stanford and also tweaked to get better, or maybe to get more at that sense of contemplation and reflection. So it should be broad-based, but also deep. It should deal with diversity, with complexity that you talked about, also with potentially conflict within. It should be practical in this day and age, but also should be critical thinking and allow for students to escape the practice. It should include creative consciousness or creative confidence that lets the students find different ways to problem solve outside, so that the world is constantly changing and it's the thing that should prepare them for that changing world. It should be a point where students can reflect on that experience that they're having and think about their purpose and why they're at Stanford. That's the type of things we want to see within what we do in liberal education. So we have a program now called Thinking Matters, and Thinking Matters came in around 2012, and Thinking Matters, what it sought to do was to be a class that looked at problems and questions and ideas, past and present, and showed why, in relationship to those problems, ideas, and questions, intellectual thinking mattered. Courses with names like the Cancer Course, courses on that were from all the way across the curriculum. So it showed that complex problems take integrated solutions, and so we have classes from the med school as well as classes from every aspect of undergraduate schools and and a variety of different disciplines. And these courses also break down structurally in terms of having tutorials, and the tutorials allow for reflection on your work, coming in contact with someone who's looking at what you're doing and asking you to think critically about how that engages the subject that you're talking about. And the course as a whole, with the problems it's raising, gets a connection to real life. And here's a quote on that from W. Du Bois. He says, "The function of the university is not simply to teach breadwinning, or to teach future teachers for the public schools, or to be a center for polite society. It is, above all, to be the organ of that fine adjustment between real life and the growing knowledge of life, and adjustment which forms the secret of civilization. And I like that sense of the space between, right, between that adjustment between real life and growing knowledge. And that sense of being able to fill that space is something that a liberal arts education, liberal education needs to do. It's interesting, right now we're reviewing that first year. And this review came out of the president's long-range vision and plan, had a design team looking at the first year, trying to create a shared intellectual experience, which in some ways you could say also sought to do what I just named as part of liberal education, sought to make it something that had reflection and contemplation. So the first quarter is meant to be one that's about self, looking at purpose and why you're here at Stanford. In that, it will look at the idea of liberal education and what a liberal education means. So it's somewhat meta in that consideration. The winter quarter, if the first quarter is on self, the next is on society. And what it will look at is questions of citizenship. And citizenship relates to what Tom has just been laying out at Parker as well. What does it mean to be a citizen? It'll first look at the question of citizenship in relationship to Stanford and in relationship to the fundamental standard which governs behavior at Stanford, and also our honor code, to get students to think of those things critically, to engage them in ways that also involve reflection. And the third quarter will be about global perspective. So the growth from self to society to the globe is what the arc of the course is said to be. Again, this is something that the Faculty Senate just heard on October 24th. It will be debated and voted on in the late winter quarter. So it may not come to be, but that's the idea of it. Another quote from Du Bois: "The true college will ever have but one goal, not to earn meat, but to know the end and aim of the end and aim of that life which meat nourishes." So the idea of not seeing college as an end in itself, but a means to an end. And that's so important in this day, that students are racing to get to that end, racing to go out and get the job, and think that all they have to do here is to take something that's going to help them, be a computer scientist. But there's so much more to it than that, and that's what we want to have happen within the first year within the education. There's another factor influencing all of this today, and that's mental health. We're seeing mental health problems like never before in terms of students coming to Stanford, but students going to any college. It's everywhere in the United States, and it also permeates the society and the pressures that students face. So we take a pre-frosh survey of students coming in, and we get a great rate of return on that survey because they're so anxious to get here. They'll fill out anything we give them. But one of the things the survey has shown, that over 70% of students felt overwhelmed in high school. And so they come in feeling anxious or stressed, and we add to that. So we need to find some programming that's going to combat that, that's going to work against that, that's going to work potentially in classes as well as in their lives within the dorms and other spaces outside of the classroom. So there's a couple of classes that are actually doing things actively about mindfulness within them. So there's a class on empathy taught by someone in social psychology. Before that, there was one taught by somebody in religion. And Jane Shaw, when she taught this course, she actually had people in the class walk in each other's shoes, literally putting those shoes on so they could feel that sense of what it means to really be empathetic, or really understand somebody else's footwear, if nothing else. But there are also courses in happiness. There's a course in as well in terms of, let me turn to that. I'm forgetting what course I want to tell you about. I told you about empathy. LifeWorks courses that look at a lot of the issues and bring mindfulness into the classroom. But I wanted to tell one other story, and that was just about architecture. The Department of Architecture, or the program in architecture rather, has been one that was followed most other programs in architecture, where the crit is hardcore, and the sense of stress. You have to stay up all night. That's the expectation. Everybody does it, and the culture in around it lives in tension. Well, they decided to change this and make the norm that you didn't have to stay all night. That the crits began differently. That the mood in the dorm mood in the classroom brought in ideas of mindfulness and of being able to talk in a way that didn't bring up the tension but allowed for communion and community. And it's really been successful. So one of the things we've done in the Office of the Vice Provost of Undergraduate Education is to have them go around and talk to other departments to see. Someone in linguistics heard it and was going to try some of the things in his class. So the space in the classroom to actually incorporate is an interesting thing that potentially may take us in directions in undergraduate education. Related to that is service learning. You heard Parker and talk about it, and also it's a great part of the efforts in cardinal service. And service learning meaning a class that has a service component added onto it, so that students can learn hands-on experientially. And that's a space, I think, for incredible learning about yourself as well as learning about others through this act of service learning. And it's interesting, at Stanford, at first our numbers weren't great in service learning courses. Maybe it was because we're in quarters, so there's about 40 we had, about 3 years ago we were at that?
Ago, yeah.
Yeah. And now we're over 178?
80.
We're into 180 courses that students have to choose from. And so that can become, as Tom said, of community, of cardinal service, an integral part of the experience of Stanford. And I'll stop there.
So I think we should turn to like what else we think we can do. And I actually wrote down a few things. Can I just share an idea or two and then we can go back and forth?
Parker, is that okay?
Sure, whatever you'd like.
All right. Well, actually, one of the things, Harry's done a great job of making the arts inescapable at Stanford. And I was thinking about this question. Maybe we should, because I'm sure it's probably entered somebody's consciousness that maybe we should make contemplative practice required at Stanford. I'm glad you're laughing, because this actually happens with service as well. People saying, "Oh, well, we should require service." I think the approach is best to make all of those things inescapable, and so I just want to say that at first. And like through Haas, what we've been trying to do is make service inescapable by using a networked approach, by not having Haas be the only place where this happens. It happens all over the university. I think that there are some other things about this that they're really about culture change. And culture is really, really difficult to change. And I think a lot of times you have to look at traditions. And where are the traditions that we could maybe insert something into to say, hey, what would it look like to make Stanford a more contemplative place? And I didn't get to the big reveal about where my daughter went to school, where she actually chose. I did not choose for her.
That's good, Tom.
Yeah, I know. I'm a good dad. But it's she went to McAllister College. It's in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I want to share with you a tradition that they have that I think is actually pretty powerful. They start any large gathering at their campus with something called the Peace Prayer. And it's a secular institution. And this is the Peace Prayer. As we continue our journey together at McAllister, may we be nourished by our years of friendship and learning. And may we draw upon them to create a more just and peaceful world, a world filled with fellowship and kinship, with respect and kindness for one another, and with the hope of a better tomorrow. Can you imagine if Stanford had something that at every major event, they would sort of open with that, like that would just at least center people and be like reminding us, like, what are we actually hoping for? As Jack Kornfield said, I think on Sunday night, what are our best intentions?
I love that idea. I think that's, it makes me think, and Parker, I'd love if you pick up on this, on the Quaker tradition. You know, my wife said that we should have started tonight with that moment of silence that happens before a Quaker meeting, which is great. And it's too late to me. We're much too far into it. But another thing that happens at Haverford, for example, the students have to together, and you need 75% of them to do this, so they all show up. They have to ratify their honor code every year.
Oh, wow.
You know, and they're coming out with a set of principles for self-government, and consensus is part of that. So really, I mean, that the statement is great, and how do you, I guess the question is, how do you get students, empower students so that they buy into this as part of it? So jumping off anything in there, Parker?
Yeah, well, these are all wonderful ideas. I want to add, I think, to perhaps another layer of discussion that doesn't exclude any of these ideas, that maybe opens another door, since I think the value of a conversation like this is to open important questions, since we don't have time to answer all of the important questions in operational detail. And my thought is simply this, that often when we are considering issues of this sort on campuses that have to do with fundamental changes in culture, in campus culture, in the outcomes of a higher education. Are we educating for the workforce? Are we educating for citizenship? Or are we educating to help people become more human? And simply that. We talk about the curriculum, we talk about the co-curriculum, but I don't think we spend enough time talking about the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum. And the piece of the hidden curriculum that really interests me a lot is the piece that's embedded in the dominant pedagogy of higher education, which is when you know, where the rubber hits the road for most students is what goes on in the classroom. That's sort of where their fates get determined. And it's often struck me how bizarre it is that a business school, for example, will add a course on business ethics at the very end of a curriculum, which has basically been teaching people how to become manipulators of an object world called money and products and markets and audiences. And I don't think an add-on course at the end in business ethics can really deflect the deformative quality of what's gone on at the heart of that business school's pedagogy for the last X number of years. Deformations of any sort are not corrected by saying the right words over them, at least in my opinion. So if you look at what's at the heart of the pedagogy in most classrooms, the hidden curriculum of the pedagogy, it often has to do with things like learning how to speed, learning how to compete, learning how to survive, sometimes learning how to please the professor or get the answers right from his or her point of view. I'm sure none of that happens at Stanford. It's a good school. But across American higher education, there's a lot of deformation that goes on in the hidden curriculum of the pedagogy itself. The classic example is that I think applies to our conversation this evening. You can teach a course on the core values of democracy, and you can teach it brilliantly. You can articulate those values as the professor. You can have students read all the right literature. They can come out as highly educated in that layer of what democracy is all about. But if you teach it in a top-down manner, where the professor does all the talking, the students stay silent and take notes, questions are left until the last 30 seconds of the class, tests require students basically to feed back what they've been told, then students are not learning the core values of a democracy. They're not coming out of that course as citizens of a democracy. They're coming out of it, they're learning how to survive as subjects of an autocratic system. And I don't think you have to look too far around this country these days to find that that's how a lot of people have been deformed, with or without the benefit of a higher education, because that's the way a lot of our educational system operates. especially, of course, under the tragic pressures of high stakes testing, which have a lot less to do with educating people than they have to do with forcing them into a Procrustean bed to take a certain shape that somebody has declared to be the shape of an educated person, which just isn't a persuasive argument to me.
So Tom, why is service an answer, or how does service answer some of the things that he's raised?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say, Parker, your point about the value of the words we say over meetings is well taken. I think that it's both a reflection of the culture of that institution, but also it could help to change it. So I think there's kind of an interesting dynamic there. To the question about service and how the hidden curriculum, there's a couple of things. One is the service learning, or even just at its core, any kind of experiential learning, is going to be much more powerful than the sort of traditional top-down. Your example of like if we had to have students actually ratify the fundamental standard every year, people would actually know it. The students here would actually internalize it more, and I think that would, that's a democratic practice that we should actually force them to do. To say, hey, when you come here, is this what your fundamental standard is? One of the things that we do with our residential advisors every year in the dorm is here's the baseline sort of how we're going to treat these kind of critical issues. Alcohol or roommate conflicts or whatever, we need you to adhere to that, because there's just a sort of, we can't go any lower than this. But we want you to be, say, adding to that what you think is going to be really important. I actually want to say, I think the curricular piece is really important, but we can't ignore how important the things that happen outside the classroom. When I leave here today, I'm going to go have dinner first with our guests. And at 10 o'clock tonight, we are going to be in Branner Hall having a conversation with students who are struggling right now over the flyering policy. We have a future guest, Ben Shapiro. He's a highly controversial, alt-right kind of figure. We have some of our students in the dorm who are saying, hey, we want this person to come. We have other students in the dorm that say this person is an affront, it's an absolute offensive sort of thing for me to see this person's face on a flyer. This person represents everything that's evil in my world. That is the crucible of democracy, of like, how do you handle the concept of, on one hand, freedom of expression, free speech, on the other, making sure that people's dignity isn't attacked and held whole. It is held whole, sorry. Their dignity should be held whole. So this is the crucible that we need to be able to help students navigate this in ways that are healthy. This is the creative tensions, and where I'm hoping that we can get students to sort of hear what are your best intentions, and thinking about that really creatively. So I absolutely think we need to think about the curriculum. Whether it's traditional, whether it's experiential, but I also want us to not forget that it may take us thinking radically about what do we mean, how are higher education institutions truly democratic, and models that the students will want to graft to and learn from.
I agree with that, and I'm not trying to pose an either or a Hobson's choice, but it's always felt to me that we don't spend enough time, again, with the hidden curriculum. And that's not only what happens in classrooms experientially, quite apart from the words that a professor speaks or the words that students speak, but the kinds of relationships that get cultivated or don't get cultivated in a classroom. For example, do students learn in a classroom to take care of those who are falling behind? Because if they did, that would have some spillover to taking care of those who are struggling with depression or with substance abuse or other things in the dorm, or at least so it seems to me. what's the hidden curriculum of just walking across that gorgeous Stanford campus and reading whatever you're reading there in terms of your sense of identity in the world? Are you picking up a sense of privilege and entitlement, or are you picking up a sense of responsibility to a world that does not have the privileges and entitlements that an institution like Stanford offers? I like your McAllister example a lot. I have to like your McAllister example because my wife is a graduate of McAllister. So I'd be in trouble tonight if I didn't stand up for that. But I think there's this deeper level of self-examination that we have to do in our institutions to ask what's happening at the formative levels of the hidden curriculum, as well as what's happening in the curriculum and what's happening in the co-curriculum or the extracurricular side of things.
We'll take time for 3 questions and then transition to our reflections if there are 3 questions for our conversationalists. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to pose to the group? Raise your hand. Yes.
My name is Cristobal Villegas. I'm visiting, so thank you for having me on your campus. It's beautiful. I'm coming from Utah. It's a quick thing. So I love where the conversation went. I love where we're talking about democracy, and a few thoughts about that were, like master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. Although the structure of democracy allows the meaning of we the people to expand, those in power, those that structure democracy, have done their best and continue to do so to limit freedom, access, and rights to many. Democracy is only as good as its majority. As a brown queer body operating in spaces curated and designed by people not like me, I feel that civic engagement is trivialized by institutions. Community organizing and activism for some is a pathway, but for others it is survival. At times, I feel if civic engagement is not direction toward dismantling oppressive systems and institutions, then it's a superficial checklist used to placate strategic plans instead of provoking and antagonizing powers at large to create liberation for communities. So my question is, how can I help students understand liberation through civic engagement to achieve that fine adjustment rather than have them check boxes for a socially constructed program?
Thank you. I think you get to start that.
I'd be glad to make a brief comment on that very important comment and question. In Healing the Heart of Democracy, I work my way toward a large section at the end on what I call a movement model of social change. Because I agree with the speaker that ultimately the kind of power that is embedded in the institutions of this or any other democracy is a kind of power that corrupts, and we see it all around us, I think, these days. What has moved the needle time and time again in human history, or what has changed the dominant paradigm, have been social movements. And what interests me a lot about social movements is that they are always conducted, they are forms of power generated by people who have had all conventional external forms of power taken away from them. They're poor, they're marginalized, they're disenfranchised in one way or another, either by sexual orientation or by color or by lack of access and wealth. And yet, social movements demonstrate what is possible when human beings access the one power that can never be taken away from them. And that's the power of the human heart, to put it one way, or of human identity and integrity, to put it another way. Movements are examples of people who say, I really don't care what punishment is going to come crashing down on my head for resisting these racist or sexist or homophobic rules. because no punishment anyone could lay upon me could possibly be greater than the punishment I lay upon myself by conspiring in my own diminishment. That, I think, has been characteristic of people who have triggered and sustained social movements. And in the book, I talk about 4 stages of social movements which spin out from this individual decision into the creation of communities of congruence and transformation, and which really have constituted half of human history. It's just that we're not taught about them. So I agree with the thrust of the question. What I also know is that every movement, what I also believe, I should say, and would want to talk with others about, is that every movement ultimately congeals into some form of institutionalization. And then the need for another movement arises. So it's a continual cycle of fluidity and structure that doesn't happen in 10 or 15 or 20-year intervals. It's sort of going on all the time. But there are periods of history that are more movement dominated and periods of history where the congealing has gotten so tight that we begin not to be able to breathe, and there's a potential for new movements to arise. So I think part of what ought to be taught in higher education is the logic of movements itself. How do you convince people of this? I think you convince them, those who are convincible, by showing the historical evidence that social movements based on the power of the human heart or human identity and integrity have been able to come up against the power of money, the power of guns, the power of access, the power of racial dominance, and create major changes.
I loved your question too. It's mostly I loved it because it's just so complicated, and I wish we could have like dinner, which we can have in a little bit to talk about this. It's a complicated world, and I actually think that the conversations that we're having about these pathways of like, here's a whole bunch of tools to try to figure out which one you need to pull, when you need to pull it to create a social change. That's one way. Like that's the conversation that I think I've been struggling with my whole career is how do I help students see a way forward for their own interests, what public good they want to bring into the world, and walk that very fine balance between it's their interest, it's not mine. It's sort of like my daughter choosing a college, right? Like it's her college, it's not mine. So I think the pathways that I was describing and what we've been talking about is one way to do that. I think the principles are the other, is the other really core one. And I didn't bring any I didn't write it down, but I would look at that respect and inclusion one as a place to start for, a conversation with a student who's really sort of asking the same question for you. But the other 2 things that I would say is I'm a huge believer in experience. Like I don't think that the best way to teach and learn is just by reading about things. I think you have to go out and experience them and sort of test the theories that you're getting from a book. A colleague of mine one time, and I don't have the citation for this, but I don't know if everybody knows Kolb's experiential learning model, that where you start with abstract conceptualization and you have an experience, you think about it, and then you reform that. And it's a cycle, right? One of the interesting things that this person's told me is that they've done studies about where people enter the learning cycle. 70% of faculty like to start at the abstract conceptualization. They like to think about things in theory. But in the sort of outside of the academy, most people actually learn better by starting with the experience and then thinking and reflecting on it. So I think experience is one that I really want to lift up. And then lastly, I think you just have to be a role model for that. And I think that getting back to what I think we can do in higher education for embedding contemplative practice, I think we need to think about ways that we can model contemplative practice. You know, what would it look like if classes all started, or many of the classes started with the 3 breaths? Inhale, exhale, let it go, be present, be centered, and just practicing those, 10-second things that we can do and making them public.
So picking up on this too, and the notion of movements and experience, I think one of the things I would say is that students need to understand that they can make change, that they do make change, that they have made change. So on our campus, Stanford, it's now going to be Jane Stanford Mall. It used to be Sarah Mall. And that came originally because out of student activism and students saying that we should look at the naming practices. And it's been something that's happened all over. So they saw it happen at Yale, they saw it happen at Princeton. But that sense of really holding the university to account is something that students can do and have done. The other thing, I think, is to understand history, or understand the importance of history and teaching history. And here I'm not talking about a static past, but the way James Baldwin talked about history, said history is always present. We act our history, we live our history. And when you see that history, you know the struggle of civil rights was not a direct pathway. It wasn't linear. It had stops and starts. It went back. But we're at different places, certainly, than we were earlier in history. So knowing that story helps galvanize, I think, and can help students in that effort. But we as administrators, as faculty, as people involved in have to work with students and understand that they can impact the institution. It's not a one-way street, but it's an incredibly, hopefully, democratic environment. And that's the type of changes we've seen around the country in terms of education, and it keeps happening. So that, I think, is a lesson we can pass on and really, hopefully, grab onto and force change.
Yeah. Do we have time for me to make one more comment?
Please make another comment. Please go ahead, Parker.
Okay, thank you. Well, at first I want to say how much I've enjoyed the conversation, and I wish I could have been there in person. But it strikes me that we've come full circle in a couple of ways. I began by saying that in effect, that for me, there has been no greater engine of contemplation than just trying to live my life, experience. Gandhi's my life as an experiment as experiments in truth. And I think this has been the lesson of all great movement leaders. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years on Robben Island, really contemplating his role in a world desperately in need of change, and emerged from that as a really remarkable, strong, and sustaining leader. And I think the second lesson that I'd want to come back to is patience. It's really hard to have patience when you see gross injustice, but I don't know of any movement that wasn't sustained over the long haul by very patient people. In 2011, I went on the civil rights pilgrimage led by Representative John Lewis through the state of Alabama. And all along the 3 days of that, at the end of which we followed John Lewis in his early 70s back across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, I was just overwhelmed emotionally and intellectually by constant reminders of the generations of people that stood behind the young people who pulled off that revolution, and who were very, very aware of the guidance and the energy and the inspiration they were getting from the ancestors, generations of ancestors who had 1 degree or half a degree of freedom, and yet were able to do with that take small steps, take them patiently past past the confidence that they could do something on to the next generation, until that confidence grew and grew, and young people in the middle of the 20th century inherited it and did something very, very big. I'm hoping that higher education can teach those habits of the heart in order to sustain the kind of ongoing movements that we need. And patience, in my mind, is not a call to take it slow. I think you have to, patience involves going full out, but knowing, as I said earlier, that you are not going to die being able to say, thank God I took on that huge task, because now everyone in the world can check it off their to-do list. That's just not going to happen. It's never happened before. But what you can do is do what you can, and you can lay the ground for the next generation of people who know what's good and true and just and beautiful and loving, and can commit themselves to it just as you have.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. We want to thank our... Thank you, Parker Palmer. Thank you, Tom Schnaubelt. Thank you, Harry Elam. I'd like to invite all of you who would like to participate in the reflection sessions to gather here if you're staying for the one with Roberta Katz, or come out into the lobby to join the one led by Michelle Renninger or the one by Emeline de la Pena. Let's again thank Harry and Tom and Parker.